It is a dangerous thing to let the government tell you who you are and define who you are because the government gives and the government takes away. The Armenians had to go to court to legally become white. If you can be awarded this category legally, and then it can be challenged by the government, and then it's re-awarded to you, what does that say about the category? It tells me that the category is absolute nonsense. And this term white is being used as a stand-in for something else that really doesn't make a lot of sense in reality. They had to prove that they were undeniably white or they would be denied citizenship. So what happened with Teitos Kartosian? Why was the United States bringing a lawsuit against him to annul his citizenship based on his race? Hi, I'm Danielle Romero, and thank you so much for joining me again today on my channel, where I've been working on a series called Becoming American, and it's been kind of delving into this really fascinating and strange history of how people started becoming white here in America. Now, if you've been on my channel for any amount of time, you know that I really don't agree with the terminology white. I think it's kind of silly and non-descriptive, but it's not just a silly phrase that has been applied to various groups over time. It actually was a legal standing in the United States. And for the Armenians, they had a very different experience than other immigrants that came over. You know, what we're talking about, we've talked about the Italian experience of becoming white and the Irish experience of becoming white. Those weren't legal processes. Those were more of these latent, slow assimilations into greater American culture. But not so for the Armenians. The Armenians had to go to court to legally become white. Now, in the captivating story of Teitos Kartosian, a renowned drug dealer from Portland, Oregon, we can find a microcosm of the larger narrative about how Armenians became white in America. Now, Portland, Oregon is probably not the first place that comes to mind when you think about the civil rights movement or racial equality. But in this then unassuming town, a landmark case unfolded in 1925. The United States versus Teitos Kartosian. That's right, the United States was bringing the suit against this Armenian immigrant. And it shed light on the intricate complexity of Armenian American identity and their delicate association with whiteness. Now, Teitos Kartosian was a Christian man who had emigrated from Armenia, and he sought U.S. citizenship in Portland in 1923. Judge Robert Bean provisionally had granted him citizenship, recognizing his whiteness, but reserving the right to initiate cancellation proceedings if necessary because Kartosian had what was noted as, quote, a trifle olive-complexioned skin, unquote. However, the Kartosian family soon found themselves at the mercy of a relentless naturalization examiner. Now, even just this phrase like strikes fear into my heart, to have someone like really examining you up close. And it's just interesting, the idea of the olive complexion skin, because at least for me, I look different depending on what season it is and how much sunscreen I wear. I literally have different makeup for winter than I do for summer because I change that much in color when I'm in the sun. And so if I'm thinking about, okay, like my citizenship is based on the color that I'm presenting, like you better believe I would have been staying completely out of the sun. But we'll pick it back up on that later. Tomlinson contended that Armenians were closely akin to non-white groups, which kind of blurred the distinction between them and, quote, white persons. The Attorney General's office initiated the United States versus Kartosian, seeking to annul his citizenship based on racial ineligibility. Now, when we're talking about this, we're actually we're using a legal framework to determine white. Remember, we talked about in 1790, the founding fathers had used the phrase that free white persons, that specific phrase, that they were eligible to become naturalized U.S. citizens. So now there's this battle over who counts inside of that framework. Who do we want to let in? Now, similar cases were happening around the country at this time because the Armenians were fleeing their homeland, which we'll get to in a second. So similar cases are happening, but they were suspended, and everybody was watching Portland, Oregon to see what would happen. Nobody was sure which way the pendulum would swing. Would Armenians count as white and be allowed to naturalize as citizens? Or was that option off the table? The whole country was waiting and watching. Now, to truly grasp the significance of Teidos Kartosian's story and many other Armenian immigrants at this time, we have to understand the context in which it unfolded. In the wake of the Armenian genocide of 1915 and the surrounding years, we saw the obliteration of over 1.5 million Armenians and a dispersion of survivors across continents. And the Armenian community was in a precarious position. Now, they had once held aspirations for their own homeland, but in 1924, their primary concern had shifted to mere survival. The establishment of the Armenian Republic in 1918 proved short-lived as it succumbed to defeat in a war with Turkey and was subsequently absorbed into the Soviet Union. In the United States, however, Armenians had managed to establish a firmer foothold, building businesses, gaining access to elite educational institutions, and pursuing white-collar professions. These immigrants were contributing so much to our country right off the bat. They were here and they were in it. It's in this context that the question of whiteness became paramount for the Armenian American community. If they weren't able to naturalize as citizens and call America home, where would they call home? But this journey actually begins even a bit earlier than the Kartosians. In 1909, there was a significant court case that took place in Boston. And there were 4 Ottoman-born Armenian men, and I'm going to totally butcher their names, so I'm going to try. Jacob Halagian, a man named Ekmagian, Avak Muradian, and Basar Bayans. I think that's how you say their names. They sought citizenship, and they succeeded in their petition against government opposition. So this was actually before Kartosian, so they were trying to get citizenship. And the news of their legal triumph appeared as a small headline on the congested third page the following morning, stating, quote, "Citizenship for Armenians." While this article may have gone unnoticed by many readers at the time, the implications of this case were momentous. A few months later, Congress actually reinforced Lowell's decision by exempting Armenians, along with Assyrians and Jews, from the prevailing rule that Asiatics were ineligible for naturalization. That is to say that a few years earlier, before Kartosian's case, they had already gone through this process and said, you know what, they're not going to count as Asian. We're going to say the Jews and the Assyrians and the Armenians, they count as white. We're putting them over here. And the founding fathers didn't tell us how to interpret that phrase, but that was the phrase that we were left with. Now, the malleability and instability of racial categories allowed Armenians to take advantage of these blurry boundaries of whiteness and transition from the potential members of, quote, a yellow race to being recognized as white persons who are now eligible for naturalization and citizenship. Their classification as white was far from firmly established. Even in the 1909 case, the argument presented in court emphasized the role of popular knowledge in determining racial categories. So, like I said, the idea of white, a white person is who can be naturalized as a citizen, you know, as far as the 1790 understanding, the idea of white is not a scientific one. They're using what they're calling popular knowledge. And so the United States contended that the average person understood what it meant to be a white person, even though there was no concrete definition. Now, the judge dismissed this argument, stating that skin color alone was an unreliable indicator of whiteness, and he further asserted that Armenians in appearance would, quote, pass undistinguished in Western Europe. The court even refuted the existence of specific racial categories, but ruled that Armenians had always been considered white persons based on this ordinary classification. So what happened with Teidos Kartosian? Why was the United States bringing a lawsuit against him to annul his citizenship based on his race? Well, the case of Tados Kartosian in 1923 was a crucial turning point in this ongoing struggle for Armenian Americans to secure their place within the category of whiteness. And it was an incredible production. To effectively present himself as white and win his case, Kartosian had to meticulously assemble a range of characteristics, behaviors, alliances, and appearances before the court. This was like a big spectacle. The construction of Armenian whiteness was crucial to securing the recognition for citizenship. They had to prove that they were undeniably white, or they would be denied citizenship. Expert witnesses, such as an anthropologist named Franz Boas, testified in support of Armenian whiteness, while, quote, ordinary Armenians who had successfully married into white European families or embraced Protestantism were called to the stand. Now, one often overlooked aspect in this case was the role played by the American-born or American-raised children of the Kartosians. There's this iconic image from the Kartosian trial where Tados is standing there with his adult daughters on either side of him, Hazel and Ori, and they testified to defend their father's application for naturalization. The defense team presented them as prime evidence of their father's whiteness and the whiteness of the entire Armenian immigrant community. However, the evidence surrounding the everyday lives of the Kartosian daughters painted a slightly different picture. Hazel, in particular, maintained really strong ties to her Armenian heritage, according to a book that I read. And she was deeply connected to her heritage in a very public way in Portland. And despite the pressure to conform during a time of assimilation, Hazel had outspokenly criticized war crimes against Armenians and tirelessly fundraised for victims of the Armenian genocide. However, in the court's eyes, Hazel and her father's racial classification remained debatable and contested. The Kartosian ruling thrust the racial identity of Armenian Americans into the spotlight, captivating public curiosity and carrying significant legal consequences. Like I said, the other stories we've been talking about, we're talking about the Poles, the Italians, the Irish, they're not going to court to bring evidence to prove that they are white enough to be American citizens. This is absolutely unprecedented as far as what we have covered on this channel so far. The story of the Kartosians culminated in July of 1925 when the U.S. District Court in Portland delivered its ruling. Armenians were deemed intricate and how also weirdly vague this whole process actually was. While the ruling granted the Kartosians legal recognition as white, it didn't erase states. They had to work to establish their place here in America. Now, many Armenian families encourage their children to adopt more American generations. If you can be awarded this category legally, and then it can be challenged by the government, and then it's re-awarded to you, what does that say about the category? It tells me that the category is absolute nonsense. And this term white is being used as a stand-in for something else that really doesn't make a lot of sense in reality. Especially when they're talking about this, like the quote, man on the street argument. If someone saw you, would they know right away? You know, I have to wonder, if the Kartosians had like spent the week outside before they came to court, they don't get citizenship? Fascinating idea to have to rely on the government, talking about, you know, native nations here in the United States that seen as sovereign by the United States, but at the same time, the United States is essentially giving them paperwork to say, hey, you guys are approved for who you are. And, you know, it is a dangerous thing to let the government tell you who you are and define who you are, because the government gives and the government takes away. And so I think it's really important for us to start, you know, kind of leaning into an alternate way of seeing ourselves and not falling into these government imposed boxes that they want to squeeze you in. And people don't belong in these boxes. It doesn't make any sense. The Supreme Court is unable to give a satisfactory explanation of who is really white. If the Supreme Court can't figure it out, If it's not based on skin color, it's not based on racial designation like Caucasian and Aryan, what is it really based on? You should ask these questions. Hi, I'm Danielle Romero, and I'm so glad you're here with me again on my channel where I have been digging into what makes someone American and questions of identity and belonging. How malleable is race in America? Can the color of one's skin be bent and contorted to fit the whims of legislative semantics and judicial pronouncements? It's a compelling question with a history that stretches back for more than a century here. And the case of Ozawa versus the United States offers a striking illustration on how race can become a contortionist act. But before we dig into the specifics of this case, I want to consider this recurring pattern in American history, this resistance to the new immigrant, the new kid on the block, the new kid at school. The pages of history and a lot of the videos that we have discussed together on here and ones that I plan to discuss in the future reveal the whitening of European immigrants, including the Irish, the Italian, the Jewish, the Polish. And fast forward even to the 1930s, Mexican Americans found themselves swept up in this cycle. Of course, these transitions were not smooth. How could they be when so many people were so visibly different from the existing white population? And the case of Southern Italians and Sicilians really underscore this point. Their darker skin tones complicated their racial categorization, causing a little hiccup on their road to whiteness. What about Asians? Could they fit neatly into the box of either free white person of good character or persons of African descent? Remember, by 1870, those were your two options. If you wanted to become an American citizen, you had to prove that you were either a free white person or that you were of African descent. The early 20th century resoundingly answered Asians no. But still, some attempted to claim whiteness in their pursuit of American citizenship. Now, I want to take a step back and just kind of touch on an idea that I'm not going to delve into in this video, because this video is about the experience of Japanese Americans, in particular a specific court case. But this idea of white supremacy, I know that you've heard this term. I don't know how you feel about it, but I want to just kind of play devil's advocate here and just point out that because white is not a monolithic group, I don't think that the experience of being a white American can be said to be monolithic, because we're not talking about monoliths. People can't be broken down into this group or that group. It doesn't work. Even though the United States courts for a long time tried to figure out how to put people in these groups, the reality is it didn't work. And like I said before, there was a lot of mental gymnastics trying to even get to this point. But let's dive into the court case. Enter a man named Takao Ozawa, a Japanese man with an American education and American lifestyle. He became the embodiment of the struggle for Asian Americans' rights to citizenship. He had 2 decades of residence here in the United States, a family that spoke English at home, and a strong commitment to American values. And he was, for all intents and purposes, an American, and he saw himself as such, but he just wanted to make it official. But his application for citizenship was denied solely because he was Japanese. So Ozawa challenged this ruling, claiming that as a Japanese man, he could qualify as a free white person. He attempted to argue that whiteness was a matter of skin color. Now, that's kind of a more modern understanding of white, right? People look at each other and they just kind of automatically assume, okay, that's a white person, this is not a white person. And so he argued whiteness is a skin color, and his skin was just as pale as white Americans. He should be treated as white and granted citizenship. Before I tell you what happened, I want to tell you about the Supreme Court justice who was overseeing this case, because his story is really fascinating. So if you saw my video on Indian Americans, the same judge presided over that case as well. And his name was Justice Sutherland. And he himself was an immigrant. His family immigrated from Britain when he was about 1 or 2 years old. So he was an immigrant, but he obviously now was a citizen. And he was a Supreme Court justice deciding cases on citizenship. Now, if this does not blow your mind, what should blow your mind is what happened next and what Justice Sutherland had to say about the white Japanese. Now, Justice Sutherland had is connected to another court case that we've covered, which was Bhagat Singh Thind, an Indian man who was seeking citizenship. And he argued that he should have been considered white because he was Caucasian. He said where he was based, where he was born in India, he had Caucasian heritage. And if he was Caucasian and he was white, well, Justice Sutherland said you can be Aryan and Caucasian, but it doesn't make you white. And he denied Singh's citizenship. But in this situation, Justice Sutherland denied Ozawa's claim that he was white because he said whiteness only extended to the Caucasian race. Wait a second. So this same justice said that Bhagat Singh Thind, that he agreed with him that, okay, he could be Caucasian and Aryan, but he wasn't white, so he couldn't be a citizen. And here, he's telling Ozawa that even though your skin color is white, you don't count as Caucasian, so you're not really white. This is insane. The mental gymnastics to deny someone's citizenship. I don't think this person could define white if he tried. Because if it's not a skin color and it's not about being Caucasian, then what is it really? And this is a really important question for today. So let's dive in a little bit more into the details of Ozawa's life in the court case. So this was a period that was rife with anti-Asian sentiment, which in the end ended up culminating in the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II. And remember, Italian Americans and German Americans were also held in internment camps during this time. A Washington state law prohibited Japanese people from owning property, and it was upheld as constitutional by the Supreme Court. This is the world that we are dealing with right now. Now, it's worth noting that the delicate tiptoeing around the issue of race in the Supreme Court's ruling was that the justices were careful to avoid directly labeling Japanese individuals as racially inferior. But instead, they simply stated that Ozawa couldn't become a citizen under the qualification of being a, quote, free white person, even though he argued that he was white. He was like, look at me, I'm white. I'm probably more pale than some of these white Americans walking around. So what's the problem? But the implication was clear. You can be as American as apple pie in character and education, but if you're not the right kind of white, citizenship was beyond reach. Now, obviously now, the requirement of being either a free white person or of African descent to be a citizen is no longer, right? That is not something that is preventing people from coming here and becoming citizens. But I think there's still a holdover with this terminology that I just take umbrage with. I take umbrage with this. And even here, the Supreme Court is unable to give a satisfactory explanation of who is really white. If the Supreme Court can't figure it out, if it's not based on skin color, it's not based on racial designation like Caucasian and Aryan, what is it really based on? You should ask these questions. Now, this judicial decision had far-reaching nativity. So that's right. You had to be either white or African to be a citizen. And he decided to argue that because he was Caucasian, when we look at the updated requirements for U.S. citizenship in 1870. But if you were somewhere in between and you didn't fit neatly into this box or this box, you were out of luck. The Supreme Court unanimously rejected Thind's argument, stating that he did not meet the, quote, common sense definition of white. In the ruling, the Supreme Court concluded that Thind's assertion of being Aryan or Caucasian based on linguistic similarity, and that Thind's resemblance in language alone was insufficient to establish a common racial origin. His culture was too different to give him the designation as white. Now, remember though, if you were of African heritage or African nativity, you could become a citizen. Now, this decision had far-reaching consequences, as you can imagine, leading to the denaturalization. That's right, they took away citizenship from about 50 Asian Indian Americans who had earlier successfully applied and received U.S. citizenship. It was a deeply unsettling moment where scientific racial categories were clashing with societal perceptions and legal interpretations. I want to share a quote from the opinion of the Supreme Court written by Justice Sutherland from the Library of Congress. He said, "The words of familiar speech, which were used by the original framers of the law, were intended to include only the type of man they knew as white. The immigration of that day was almost exclusively from the British Isles and northwestern Europe, whence they and their forebears had come. When they extended the privilege of American citizenship to, quote, any alien being a free white person, it was these immigrants, bone of their bone and flesh of their flesh, and their kind, whom they must have had affirmatively in mind. It is a matter of familiar observation and knowledge that the physical group characteristics of the Hindus render them readily distinguishable from various groups of persons in this country commonly recognized as white." I just want to pause there and just reiterate the fact that you needed to be a free white person of good character or someone from African heritage. But think about that in the terms of what he's describing here. The children of English, French, German, Italian, Scandinavian, and other European parentage quickly merge into the mass of our population and lose the distinctive hallmarks of their European origin. On the other hand, it cannot be doubted that the children born in this country of Hindu parents would retain indefinitely the clear evidence of their ancestry. The 1923 Literary Digest article was called "Hindus Too Brunette to Vote Here," which is available through the South Asian American Digital Archive. Now, to understand this ruling, we have to delve into the reasoning provided by the court. The court justified its decision by stating the words that free white person, which were from. Now, the court believed that the original framers of the law had intended only one type of person to be white: people from the British Isles and northwestern Europe. Finn had such an interesting perspective during this legal case because he didn't try to fight for equality. What he actually tried to do was kind of sneak in through the back door. And he pointed out that he was a, quote, high caste Hindu, and stating that because he came from North India, the, quote, original home of the Aryan conquerors, then he must also belong to the Caucasian or Aryan race. Now, if you know anything about the caste system in India, it's pretty horrifying. He was trying to use this to his advantage to say, hey, we're not a monolithic group. There are levels and designations to people from India, and I'm at the top. And I'm of the same heritage as so many of these other groups who are allowed to be white. Now, as a result of this decision, the path to American citizenship for individuals of Indian ancestry was just abruptly closed. Like I said, people were losing their citizenship, and now it's just over. Finn's own lawyer, Sakaram Ganesh, actually faced denaturalization himself during this court case. Now, the repercussion of these revoked naturalized statuses were enormous. So I want you to imagine that you've gotten citizenship in a country and all the rights thereof. Now it's gone. What rights do you have? Well, for instance, certain Asian Indian landowners in California suddenly found themselves subjected to the California Alien Land Law of 1913. Attorney General Ulysses S. Webb, who is a strong advocate for the Asiatic Exclusion League, you heard that right, actively worked to invalidate land purchases made by these people, promising to prevent Indians from acquiring or leasing land. With mounting pressure and the Immigration Act of 1917 preventing new immigration from coming in, which could have supported the Indian American community, the more people coming in kind of allow their voice, many Indians chose to leave the country. As a result, by 1940, only half of the original Indian population remained in America, about 2,400. It wasn't until 1935, so it's more than a decade later, when the Nye Lee Act was passed, granting World War I veterans eligibility for naturalization regardless of race. And at this point, Finn made another petition for naturalization. This was his third one. And finally, based on his status as a U.S. military veteran, he was granted United States citizenship nearly 20 years after his initial application. As World War II unfolded, and public support for Asian Indians grew, along with the impending independence of India, the Indian community activated for an end to legislative discrimination. The repeal of the Chinese exclusion laws in 1943 and the extension of naturalization privileges to the Chinese community provided hope for similar progress among Asian Indians. Now, despite opposition from certain members of Congress and the American Federation of Labor, the Indian community gained support from influential congressmen and President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And ultimately, on July 2nd, 1946, President Truman signed the Luce-Celler Act into law. This landmark legislation not only reversed the Finn decision, but also explicitly extended racial eligibility for naturalization to individuals from India, establishing a modest annual immigration quota of only 100 individuals. So they're saying, okay, well, you can come, but only this many of you can come. Now, the passage, though, of this act represented a significant milestone nonetheless in the fight against discrimination. I think one of the biggest takeaways for me in this story, honestly, is the fact that it wasn't just you have to be white to be a citizen, because you can be white or African, but not anything in between. And I think this just goes to show how dangerous these binary groupings are. People have kind of commented on these videos, why are you only going after white as being something silly? Why aren't you going after black as something silly? Now, again, I know people use these terms to self-identify, and if that's how you identify, that's great. Like use whatever terms you prefer. But when I'm stepping back and we're doing kind of the bird's eye view historically of this, to force people to say, I belong to this group or this group, and they're somewhere in between. I would love your thoughts on this, because again, we've been kind of breaking things into this idea of like, who counts as white? Well, here we have this, it's like, who counts as white or who counts as black? And anything in between is out of here. And the other thing is like, this obviously is going beyond just skin color though, because I have had friends who have, origin from South Asia, and some of them are darker than people with African ancestry. So we can't just go and say, well, this is just colorism, because if it was just colorism, then they would not say people from African ancestry were okay to become citizens. Now, I know that it's directly tied to the Emancipation Proclamation and the enslaved people here in the United States, but it's just another part of this equation that we have to wrestle with. So if you are interested in watching any more videos like this, I'll leave the playlist here at the end. Let me know what you think. We'll talk soon.